We're one step closer to seeing American aid on Gaza's shores.
Crate after crate of food and water bound for Gaza are loaded Thursday on the Sagamore container ship to be transferred to another U.S. ship.
Plus, Russia launches a counteroffensive in eastern Ukraine.
Russian forces were trying to break through the Ukrainian defense line with armored vehicles. Zelensky emphasized that the Russians can increase and strengthen their forces in this direction. As of now, Ukrainian forces repulsed the attack. The fighting continues.
And later, a plan to use Russia's money to pay for Ukraine's defense, and a look at election results in Chad. Today is Friday, May 10th, and this is VOA's Flashpoint Global Crises. Good evening, I'm Steve Karish in Washington. On Friday, the UN General Assembly debated and voted on a Palestinian effort to send their application for membership back to the UN Security Council for a second look. Riyad Mansour is the Palestinian ambassador to the UN. In an emotional address to the General Assembly, he lays out the hardships of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
We share with many nations represented in this hall the suffering they endured, the struggles they led, the dreams they had. You have been witnesses to the story of Palestine, and you can only look at it from the prism of your own people's journeys towards liberation. Liberation so life can prevail. Liberation so peace can prevail. We want peace. We want freedom. There is no word harder to pronounce when tens of thousands of your people have been killed. We do not use it lightly. We want peace. Our freedom is not an obstacle to peace. It is the only path leading to it.
Gilad Erdan is Israel's ambassador to the UN. He counters by saying that granting UN membership to the Palestinians would be legitimizing Hamas and rewarding terrorism.
And following the Allies' victory, this institution here, the United Nations, was founded with the mission of ensuring such tyranny never raises its ugly head again. Never. Today, you are about to do the exact opposite and advance the establishment of a Palestinian terror state, which will be led by the Hitler of our times. The Hitler of our times. In the 1940s, the world united to destroy a murderous regime. Yet today, with sick and twisted irony, the very body established to prevent evil is now welcoming a terror state into its ranks.
As Erdogan finished his speech, he put a copy of the UN Charter into a portable paper shredder to illustrate his point that he believes the UN would be a meaningless institution if Palestinians led by Hamas were able to be admitted. Not surprisingly, the resolution easily obtained a two-thirds majority to pass, with 143 votes in favor and 9 against, with 25 abstentions. Now, the resolution does not grant Palestine membership to the UN. It merely says it is qualified for it, and it will send the question back to the Security Council, which would need to approve it before Palestine can become a full member. The U.S. vetoed such a resolution before and would likely do it again. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the first shipment of aid bound for a new pier built by the U.S. military in Gaza left a port in Cyprus on Thursday. VOA's Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has the story.
Crate after crate of food and water bound for Gaza are loaded Thursday on the Sagamore container ship to be transferred to another U.S. ship, the MV Roy Benavidez. The U.S. military now pre-positioning aid at sea, while waiting to move a newly completed U.S.-made floating pier into position off the Gaza coast. Pentagon Press Secretary Major General Pat Ryder.
since the Benavides will be on the scene, so to speak, the day we pull the trigger and start operations, that then frees up the Sagamore to go back to Cyprus to load up with additional aid. But because we're, again, waiting for the appropriate security and weather conditions to kick this off, we're going to use that time to our advantage.
The situation in Gaza grows more urgent by the day, with life-sustaining aid running low. Michael O'Hanlon is with the Brookings Institution.
The 2 million Palestinians who live in Gaza are collectively near famine. This is, as I understand the numbers, one of the most dire food situations really in recent history.
Officials say the U.S.-built pier will bring in dozens of truckloads of aid per day, at a time when defense analyst Michael O'Hanlon says airdrops from the U.S. and others, along with truck traffic at border crossings, has been drastically inadequate.
This pier is desperately needed and actually overdue. And the numbers I've seen imply that it could actually help deliver a substantial fraction of what's needed.
Officials say security measures are in place to protect U.S. troops on the pier and civilians distributing aid on the beach. Again, Pat Ryder.
We would certainly hope that if Hamas truly does care about the Palestinian people, that they would not threaten humanitarian assistance being delivered to people in dire need. And for our part, we'll continue to work with the international community to rush that aid in.
Officials say aid distribution via sea could begin as soon as next week. Carla Babb, VOA News, the Pentagon.
Aid groups say a Rafah invasion would be catastrophic. The UN says most of the territory's 2.3 million Palestinians suffer from hunger and that northern Gaza is already experiencing a full-blown famine. VOA's Laurie London spoke with Kieran Donnelly. He's Senior Vice President for Crisis, Response, Recovery, and Development at the International Rescue Committee. He says even the limited operation that Israel launched earlier this week has thrown humanitarian operations into crisis mode.
The situation on the ground in Rafah today is characterized by chaos, fear, and a huge amount of humanitarian need. Rafah has become hugely overcrowded, 1.3 million people sheltering there, having fled, some of them displaced multiple times from other parts of Gaza. It is acutely short of all of the essential supplies that people need for life. And while there's a little bit more aid getting into Rafah because of its proximity to the border with Egypt than there is into northern Gaza, where we're seeing the worst famine-like conditions. Conditions in Rafah are hugely difficult for people who are trying to survive there. With the announcement of the evacuation orders from Israel and the commencement of an accelerated level of shelling and bombing in Rafah over the last few days, what we've seen is real panic start to set in. People are fleeing, trying to make a decision whether or not to flee. Can they afford to flee? Where will they go? There's nowhere safe in Gaza for people to go. The areas that have been designated for people to relocate to are not in themselves safe and have even less access to services and to aid than Rafah does. So it's an incredibly worrying situation on the ground. And if Israel does proceed with a full-on assault on Rafah, we're going to see a humanitarian catastrophe even worse than what we've experienced over the last number of months.
My understanding is that the last working hospital is now not working in Rafah.
I've seen reports, yes, that the hospital has been closed down in order to evacuate. We haven't been able to verify that directly ourselves. But this comes obviously in the wake of the complete degradation of the health system across Gaza as a whole, where almost all of the hospitals in Gaza are not functioning. Only a very few remain functioning at a fraction of their pre-crisis levels. The primary healthcare system has collapsed, and this comes in a context in which the numbers of people seeking healthcare, in need of healthcare, has grown exponentially as a result, not just of bombing and fighting, but also of overcrowding, lack of access to food supplies, lack of access to safe water, the unsanitary conditions in which they live. My colleagues are reporting rivers of sewage flowing down streets with children playing in them. And in a context like that, with this continued degradation of the healthcare system and the latest reports of the closure of the last hospital in Rafah, its public health catastrophe is on the brink of exploding.
What about the new pier that we hear has just been unfinished that the U.S. military was working on. Will that make a significant difference in getting aid in?
It will make a modest difference in getting aid in. Given the situation on the ground, any aid that can be provided is a welcome addition to the overall response effort. However, we have to be absolutely clear that the peer does not have the ability to deliver the aid that's needed at the volumes that it's needed, that it is considerably more expensive than the land route option. And there is no guarantee, no clarity yet as to whether the aid that's provided through the peer will have any kind of lighter check process, assessment process than the aid that goes through the border crossing. So right now, there's a very arbitrary, intrusive, bureaucratic process that's delaying significantly the aid that can get through and limiting the aid that can get through the border crossings. And as far as we know, that's going to apply equally to aid coming through this floating pier arrangement. And so whether it's airstrikes, piers, anything that can be done to provide aid is good, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to be deluded into thinking that that's a substitute for what's really needed, which is opening border crossings, reducing the checks at border crossings, and a ceasefire, an end to the fighting to create the conditions on the ground inside Gaza in which aid agencies can operate and in which people can move to receive aid.
Absent that, if Israel follows through with what it says it plans to do in Rafah?
If Israel follows through on its plans and in the absence of a ceasefire agreement, we're going to see further mass displacement. We're going to see large numbers of people inevitably killed and injured. And we are going to see an acceleration of both the public health threats, the disease vectors that are already rampant inside Gaza, and the food insecurity situation, the famine that is creeping its way southwards from northern Gaza will only accelerate.
That's VOA's Laurie London speaking with Kieran Donnelly of the International Rescue Committee. Changing gears now, President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced that Russian troops have begun a counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region, and the U.S. has announced a new aid delivery to Ukraine in the next couple of weeks. Meanwhile, Russian troops have significantly increased the pace of ground attacks in the east. VOA's correspondent Anna Chernikova has the latest from Kyiv.
On May 10th, President Zelensky announced that Russian troops had begun counteroffensive actions on the border of the Kharkiv region.
Росія почала нову хвилю контрнаступальних дій на цьому напрямку.
Russian forces were trying to break through the Ukrainian defense line with armored vehicles. Zelensky emphasized that the Russians can increase and strengthen their forces in this direction. As of now, Ukrainian forces repulsed the attack. The fighting continues. In its latest report, experts of the Institute for the Study of War note that Russian troops have significantly increased the pace of ground attacks in eastern Ukraine over the past months. Additionally, the Ukrainian military reports that the number of combat operations has increased significantly from 84 on May 8th to 146 on May 9th. They noted that most of the combat operations are taking place in the territory from the Kharkiv region to the border zone of Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. The Ukrainian military believes that the current intensification of Russian attacks is probably related to the goal of the Russian military to take advantage of the relative weakness of Ukraine before the arrival of Western military aid to the front line. Meanwhile, the US has announced new arms deliveries to Ukraine in the coming weeks. According to Matthew Miller, the spokesperson for the United States Department of State, the best thing Washington can do as a partner of Kyiv is to continue its military and economic support and to do everything in the US power so that Ukraine can stand on its own 2 feet. Earlier, Miller said that the United States is working on the preparation of a new package of defense assistance for Ukraine within the limits of the funding provided to Kyiv.
Провів нараду з керівниками наших Сил оборони України, головком Сирський, начальник Генерального штабу Баргилевич.
President Volodymyr Zelensky in his evening address said that he held a meeting with the leadership of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the Chief of the General Staff, and the Minister of Defense to discuss the speed up of the weapon supply from the allies. He added that Ukraine knows what preparations Russia is taking and will be ready with an appropriate response. As a result of the latest Russian shelling of energy infrastructure across the country, Ukraine continues to experience a significant shortage of electricity. Energy officials have doubled the duration of power restrictions for industrial users. It was announced that emergency shutdowns may be introduced if the consumption increases. The Ukrainian public is instructed to reduce the consumption of electricity to avoid additional power outages. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
You're listening to Flashpoint Global Crises from the Voice of America. I'm Steve Karish in Washington. Now, another aspect of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The European Union has agreed in principle to a deal that would allow the use of proceeds from frozen Russian assets to supply weapons for Ukraine. As Henry Ridgwell reports, allies in Washington want the EU to go much further.
Russia's central bank held billions of dollars of cash and assets in Western financial institutions and companies. Those assets were frozen by the West in the wake of Moscow's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Some 70%, amounting to more than $200 billion worth, are held in Brussels at the Euroclear depository. The United States, along with Britain and Canada, have been pushing for those assets to be fully seized and used to help Kyiv fight Russia's invasion. But Europe is being more cautious. European Union ambassadors meeting in Brussels Wednesday agreed in principle to use only the interest earned on the Russian assets. Ian Bond is an analyst at the Centre for European Reform.
Now, what the EU is talking about is not seizing the principal, but using the interest, which might amount to, 7 or 8 billion a year, and using that for the benefit of Ukraine. Now, it's a worthwhile sum of money, but it is a tiny sum of money compared to the amount of damage that Russia has done to Ukraine.
The deal should be fully signed off at an EU finance ministers' meeting next week. EU officials said Russia would pay directly for its crimes, and the first $1 billion payment should be available to buy weapons by the summer. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Monday the funds can be used not only for procurement of weapons within Europe, but also outside Europe, because what really matters now is that weapons can be delivered as quickly as possible. Some in Europe fear the US plan to fully seize Russia's assets would trigger a lengthy legal battle and may prompt other countries like China to sell their euro investments, destabilizing the currency. Others expect Russia will retaliate by seizing more assets belonging to Western companies still operating in the country.
My view on that is these companies have had 2 years to get out of the Russian market. If they stayed in, it was because they thought it was okay to continue to earn money in Russia, despite the fact that it was waging a brutal war of aggression against one of its neighbors. And if they lose their shirts now, that's their tough luck.
EU officials hope the deal will be fully implemented by June. That is when Hungary is due to take over the rotating EU presidency, and there are concerns that it could move to block the deal if it isn't fully signed off, as Budapest seeks to maintain close ties with Russia. Henry Ridgwell, VOA News.
In mid-April, the United States deployed a Tomahawk missile system to the Philippines. It was a move condemned by both Russia and China. The medium-range launcher can reach targets up to 1,600 kilometers away. Now, Russia says it plans to ramp up production of its own medium-range missile systems. Katrina Besidna has the story, narrated for us today by Anna Rice.
Russia says it will increase production of and upgrade its arsenal of intermediate and shorter-range missiles. In a statement this week, Russia's foreign ministry says the action is a response to the U.S. deployment of similar missile systems to Europe and the Asia-Pacific region, and the flow of increasingly sophisticated weapons from the West to Ukraine. William Hill is from the Wilson Center.
I interpret this statement as an attempt to frighten or to deter the U.S., the U.K., United Kingdom, and France, and other NATO allies from supporting Ukraine. None of this is unprecedented. It's just unsettling. It makes the situation more tense.
The statement also mentions a recent U.S. deployment of a medium-range Tomahawk cruise missile system to the Philippines, something that until 2019 was prohibited as part of the 1987 INF Arms Control Treaty between the U.S. and Russia. The United States withdrew from the INF Treaty back in 2019, accusing Russia of violating the agreement, a charge Moscow denies. Daryl Kimball is the executive director of the Arms Control Association.
So what we're seeing is that in the absence of effective arms control agreements, the United States and Russia may begin redeploying these types of weapons.
So far, Russia has rejected America's proposal to come back to the table for new arms control talks. And experts say without treaties in place, weapons production will rise. Daryl Kimball is the executive director of the Arms Control Association.
There is a possibility of an unconstrained arms race, not just between the United States and Russia, but possibly also involving China, which is also building up its nuclear arsenal.
Hill notes that in the past, Russia has threatened the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield.
In my view, it's a very dangerous tactic. It's playing with fire, and it increases the chance of an accident. But I know I worked for a long time with senior figures in the Russian military. I know they understand the dangers in these weapons. I know they understand how serious even contemplating their use would be.
Russia and the United States have the largest number of nuclear weapons in the world, together holding more than 85% of the world's inventory. For Katerina Besedina in Washington, NRI's VOA News.
And finally today, Chad's election results are being disputed after interim president Mahamat Idris Deby was declared winner, according to provisional results, something opposition leader Success Masra described as an attempt to steal the vote. Reuters' David Doyle has more.
Chad's interim president, Mahamat Idris Deby, has been declared winner of the country's May the 6th election. And that's even as his main challenger said that he had won. Success Masra has called on the security forces and his supporters to oppose what he described as an attempt to steal the vote.
Don't let your destiny be stolen. To the military, to the police, to all the members of our country's defense and security forces, you have seen me work alongside you, with you, for you. I say to you, refuse to obey unjust orders.
Chad's junta has become the first of several coup-hit countries in West and Central Africa to stage a return to constitutional rule via the ballot box. Analysts had widely predicted that Deby, who seized power after rebels killed his long-ruling father in April 2021, would win. However, Masra, an opposition leader turned prime minister, had drawn larger-than-expected crowds on the campaign trail.
Mahamat Idris Deby.
Nevertheless, Chad's state election body said late on Thursday that Deby had won with over 61% of the vote, citing provisional results.
61,03%.
Masra, it said, had secured around 18.5%. The disputed results cap a fraught electoral period in which opposition figure Yaya Dillo was shot and killed. Some opposition parties had called for a boycott over vote-rigging concerns. With tensions running high, large numbers of security forces were deployed at major intersections in the capital N'Djamena ahead of the results announcement. What happens next is unclear.
That's David Doyle of Reuters reporting for us today. And that's going to wrap up today's show. There's more VOA coverage 24 hours a day on our website, voanews.com, and across our social media platforms. On behalf of everyone at VOA, thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Steve Karish.
For deeper dives and expert analysis, listen to VOA Podcasts. Issues in the News explores the biggest stories every weekend, while International Edition keeps you informed every weekday. Plus, with the 5-minute newscast at the top of every hour, you're always up to date.